Great. So welcome to the Mass Land Conservation Conference. We are here, hopefully you're here for the session on how to do climate smart forest management and get paid for it. So let me just get this started. Oops, there's too many buttons. Oops, here we are. Welcome to the 2022 Mass Land Conservation Conference. I mean, we couldn't do this without our amazing sponsors. We really want to highlight and thank our lead sponsors, the Trustees of Reservations and Mass Audubon, as well as our patron sponsors, the Fields Pond Foundation, Vineyard Wind, Landvest, and the Nature Conservancy. And there's a whole host of other supporters and friends that have sponsored this conference and make this whole gathering possible. So we really appreciate all the support from everybody. So I will stop the share there. And I want to welcome our two speakers for this session on how to do climate smart forest management and get paid for it. First, I'd like to introduce Laura Marx. Laura is a climate solution scientist with the Nature Conservancy's Massachusetts chapter. She leads the chapter's work on natural climate solutions, so better management and protection of forests, wetlands, and farms to reduce and remove carbon emissions. As part of her work on how forests are impacted by and can help fight climate change, Laura leads a regional conservation partnership called the Green Mountains to Hudson Highlands Linkage, AKA the Berkshire Wildlife Linkage. And she also works to improve state policies related to land conservation and forest management. Laura will be speaking first. And then I'd also like to introduce Josh Rapp. Josh is a conservation scientist for Mass Audubon, where he leads the Forest Resilience Program. So this includes managing projects that develop and promote resilient forests and enhance carbon storage through forest stewardship planning, carbon sequestration, and ensuring that forest management practices are appropriate for changing climate conditions to safeguard our water, wildlife habitat, and forest carbon stocks. And that while they're doing their presentation, I'll be running the slides from my computer. So they'll be letting me know when to advance the slides. They do have a session for questions. And so please feel free to type your questions into the chat during the sessions as they come up, and we'll come back to those at the question time kind of in the middle of the presentation, and then there'll be more opportunity for questions at the end. They also are kindly going to be sharing their slides, and those will be available on the conference website. I believe starting next week, the first week of April is when they're kind of guaranteed to be up on the website. The recording of this session will be available for approximately 60 days. So if you wanted to come back and hear something or be part of that, you can get the recording again later. So that is the welcome. I want to thank Laura and Josh for this presentation, and I will start sharing their slideshow, which I see I need to go back to the beginning, but hang on one second.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Thanks everyone for joining us, especially at this late afternoon, evening session. I'm really excited to be co-presenting with Josh too, because we've been working on this climate smart forest management project for a couple years now together. And so this is, I've been really looking forward to talking with everyone about it. So I'm actually going to start by telling you something you already know. And next slide, please, Cynthia. So if you are in this webinar, you know that we are in the middle of a climate crisis. And Cynthia, if you could just, thank you. So this is not, climate change is not some distant thing that's going to impact our kids and our grandkids. It is something that we are facing now. However, when you work on climate change, one of the hopeful things about it is that we know how to solve it. If I were trying to cure cancer, I wouldn't know what I needed to do if I were trying to end war, same thing. But with solving climate change, we know what we need to do. And the single biggest action that we need to take is to reduce our emissions, reduce our use of fossil fuels, and ramp up our use of renewable energy. However, because we've waited so long to act, and because climate change is something we're facing now, we also need to do two other things simultaneously. And these are really the ones that Josh and I are going to be focusing on in this webinar. So in addition to reducing emissions, leaving fossil fuels in the ground, we also need to remove emissions. We need to draw down that carbon pollution that's already in the atmosphere. And the only tool that we have to do this right now at scale and at cost is nature. And then simultaneously, because climate change is already here, we need to adapt to it. We need to adapt to the changes that we're already seeing. And when I say we need to adapt both as human communities and to help the natural communities around us adapt as well. Next slide, please. So I want to avoid there's two different terms that people throw around when they are talking about nature and climate change. And one of those is nature-based solutions. And so nature-based solutions is using nature to solve a problem. You can use nature to solve all sorts of problems. There's a subset of nature-based solutions called natural climate solutions, and that is using nature to solve the problem of there being too much carbon pollution in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Natural climate solutions are ways to protect, better manage, and restore our natural systems, so forests, farms, grasslands, and wetlands, in order to reduce and or remove carbon emissions. Next slide, please. And in Massachusetts, as you might expect, because most of our land is forested, forests are one of those big pieces of opportunity when it comes to natural climate solutions. However, I want to point out that much of what we're talking about today is about how to manage forests with, among other things, carbon in mind. Carbon is one of the newest values of our forests that we talk about, but it's usually not the most important. And so we never want to lose sight of the fact that we have been protecting and managing forests in this state and elsewhere for all sorts of reasons for a very, very, very long time, because forests also filter our drinking water. They provide habitat for all the species that we like to go out and watch as they move about the forest. They provide places for recreation. They provide our wood products. They improve our health, all of these things that we get from forests, in addition to their power to directly fight climate change. And the other thing that is important to remember as we talk about these forest management techniques is that forests are this powerful tool to fight climate change, but they're also not immune to the changes that climate change brings. And so we also want to always be thinking when we make our management decisions about whether what we're doing is helping the forest to adapt, to be resilient, to bounce back from climate change impacts. Next slide, please. So Josh and I are here mostly to talk about climate smart forestry. And it was a little surprising to me when I first started hearing this term to find out that it's actually really well defined in the scientific literature. You can go read long, very boring papers about what climate smart forestry is. But I can sum it up by saying that anything that is a climate smart forestry practice does two things, basically. The first is it maintains or increases forest carbon stocks on the landscape. So the amount of carbon that's in wood and soils and leaves and other parts of the forest. And it maintains or increases forest resilience. And that's the forest's ability to adapt to climate change, or sometimes we refer to it as its ability to bounce back from climate change impacts or recover. From the time that people started using this term, and even before, there were a lot of landowners, foresters, land trust decision makers asking, what does that look like? What counts as climate smart forest management in our forest? What would be on that list? Next slide, please. And the answer turns out to be a range of things. So climate smart forestry doesn't always have to be new and weird. A lot of the things that are climate smart forest management actions are the same things that we used to call sustainable forestry or growing large trees. These are things we've been doing for a very long time. And the people who were working the land before European colonists came were also doing a lot of these same things. So these are very old school. They've been around for a long time. We know that they work, sort of management techniques. Then there are other pieces that are small tweaks. So maybe you're doing much the same type of management that you used to do, but now you're taking into account the fact that precipitation is falling in different times of the year, or that different species are going to be better adapted to the conditions that we have on the land now. And then finally, there are some new and different actions. And this slide comes from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So they put in here, some of these may even seem wild and crazy, like assisted migration or planting different species into the forest. So all of these can make up climate smart forest actions. And I'm going to turn things over to Josh to talk about the process that we and others went through to come up with a list of these climate smart forestry actions that work in our forests. Next slide, please, Cynthia.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks, everyone. Laura mentioned and Cynthia mentioned, I'm Josh Rapp. I'm a conservation scientist with Mass Audubon. I've been working with Laura for a wide range of partners to develop this list of climate smart practices that I'll be sharing with you. As Laura mentioned, we've approached this from both a carbon-centric perspective and an adaptation-centric perspective. In both cases, we took a structured and rigorous approach to identifying and tuning the practices that would meet the objectives of increasing carbon stored in forests and improving the resilience of forests to climate change. This started with a review of the scientific literature, followed by consideration of the regional context for forest management in the Northeast. Finally, a team of experts reviewed, evaluated, and refined these practices. Next slide, please. This is a partial list of the stakeholders who participated in this process. The process was led by scientists at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and involved a wide range of stakeholders, including those from state and federal government, nonprofit conservation organizations, academic institutions, and private foresters, loggers, and landowners. Next slide, please. In the end, many of the climate smart practices we identified have both carbon and adaptation benefits. As Laura mentioned, this is by design. The prerequisite for a practice to be included in the list of carbon practices was that it is not maladaptive. So no displacing native forests by growing fast-growing exotic trees to suck up carbon, but creating a sterile forest with no wildlife. In the following slides, I will present what we somewhat tongue-in-cheek called the one list that includes the practices identified and refined through these two parallel processes. The practices include ones that keep forests as forests, add trees and forests to the landscape, reduce forest health stressors, and take either a hands-off or an active approach, depending on ecological need and landowner goals. These practices appear in a number of publications and programs, including the ones shown here. We'll share some links to these and other resources at the end of the talk. The Healthy Forest for Our Future guide was developed in the process of creating the carbon practices and focuses on those. The Caring for Your Woods, Adapting to Climate Change Conditions booklet is available from Massachusetts DCR and describes principles for managing forests in a changing climate. Foresters for the Birds and New England Forestry Foundation Exemplary Forestry are other places that some of these practices are described. Next slide, please. The first category of climate smart practices is to keep the forests we have. Reducing or eliminating the conversion of forest to non-forest helps store and sequester more carbon, since forest lands contain more carbon than most other land use types. Keeping land in natural forest cover also maintains the ability of landscapes to adapt to climate conditions. Responding quickly to major disturbance in the forest aids in post-disturbance recovery, where ecosystem services and forest condition have been highly degraded. Doing this can involve using one or more of the practices that I'll talk about next. Next slide, please. The next category will be about adding trees to the landscape. These trees should...
Yeah.
I'll pause here. You can go to the next slide if that's possible.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it to go, and it's not going yet.
Okay. Well, I can keep talking.
Okay, yeah, just keep talking.
Yeah. So this next category is all about adding trees to the landscape. These trees should be climate-informed species, and by which that I mean that they're matching the site and the climate of that site. Planting in most instances should be used with invasive species control and deer protection if that's needed. The differences in these practices are in the context of planting, whether in areas that used to be forest but are not currently, that would be reforestation. As a supplement to an existing forest that is understocked, that would be underplanting climate-adapted trees, or in an urban or residential setting. In all cases, planting trees stores additional carbon and helps ecosystems adapt to climate change. Next slide, please. Reducing non-climate stressors can also help forests adapt to climate change while improving carbon sequestration over the long term. Removing invasive species and protecting seedlings from deer and moose browse give native tree seedlings a leg up and help forests regenerate. Removing invasive species can be done using physical or mechanical means, and where necessary, herbicides. This often needs to be done over several years to be effective. While controlling deer populations would be most efficient in facilitating forest regeneration at a regional scale, tree shelters and fencing are also effective in protecting individual seedlings. Next slide, please. Where forests are healthy and landowner goals are compatible, letting nature take its course can be beneficial for both carbon and adaptation. Intentional passive management can maintain ecological, carbon, and other benefits. Reserves can be established on all or just a portion of the forest. Reserves are not appropriate everywhere and may be best on sites with a high carbon density and low vulnerability to climate change impacts. Unique or sensitive sites, which may include at-risk species, sensitive ecosystems, for example, vernal pools or riparian areas, or potential climate refugia, are also good places to abstain from harvesting. Maintaining these areas preserves the adaptive capacity of these systems and may support landscape level adaptation. A more temporary version of a reserve is to wait longer between harvests. This allows trees to grow larger and become more likely to be used in long-lived wood products when they are harvested. For example, this may take the form of delaying a harvest in your current 10-year management plan until the next 10-year plan or even longer. Next slide, please. Finally, harvests can be designed so that they have adaptation benefits while maintaining more carbon on the landscape than would occur at a typical harvest. A resilience harvest is designed to improve the health and function of the current native forest vegetation in response to climate change. This can reduce the impact from current and future stressors and disturbances, diversify forest conditions to increase the capacity for adaptive responses, and promote future adapted regeneration of the current native plant community. Resilience harvest can accommodate a wide variety of approaches, including the two specialized practices that maintain more carbon in the forest than typical. One of these balances the creation of gaps to promote regeneration with the retention of existing carbon stocks. For example, retaining a minimum number of large diameter trees, snags, and live but dying trees, while limiting gap creation to say no more than 20% of the parcel. Another practice is a light thinning that retains large diameter trees, snags, and importantly, the diversity of species in the forest. In some cases, it is desirable to facilitate transitions in forest communities towards assemblages that are expected to be better adapted to future conditions. This is done where climate change is expected to exceed the capacity of the existing forest community to cope with climate impacts and associated stressors. This practice may lead to a decline in forest carbon stocks for a longer period of time than a resilience harvest, so it is most recommended where forest health issues are likely to cause a to collapse in the near future. Next slide. And with that, we can take some questions on the first part of our talk before we move on to some case studies.
Right now, we don't have any questions in the chat. Does anybody want to type a question into the chat to either Laura or Josh or both of them? So there's a question here of how do we know how much thinning to do? What are the levels?
Well, I can answer that question on a high level, and then I think Laura is going to get into a little bit more detail on that for a specific program. Essentially, it depends how quickly you want the carbon to come back. So when you do a thinning, you are removing carbon from the forest. The more carbon you remove, the longer it takes to come back. And so it depends on the time frame you're thinking about. Often, kind of rule of thumb is maybe 25%. And it's not just how much carbon we remove, it's like which trees you remove. You want to remove trees that are less vigorous. You want to maintain the trees in the forest that are going to be, that will grow the best into the future and will respond most strongly to that thinning.
Yeah, and Josh, that was a great answer. I don't have much to add, though. As you mentioned, the specifics about the thinning practice in the climate smart forestry list are detailed in the Healthy Forests for Our Future guide. And that is based on how much you can thin and still see your carbon recover within 20 years. So it ends up not being very much. So you can basically remove less than 20, it's about 22% of the basal area, assuming you're following kind of all the guidelines. And I have a paper copy here because I keep referring to it. So I'm just going to hold it up. But there's a 2-page spread in each of these for anyone who's like, okay, but exactly what do I do, that lays out if carbon is your driving focus and in a short time frame, then you would want to follow the guidance there. As Josh mentioned, your focus might be carbon on a long time frame. It might be the health of certain types of species. You might be looking to generate income. There are all sorts of reasons you would want to do thinning in a different way. And Josh, I think also, and I'm not sure whether this is in any of the DCR materials potentially, but there's also sort of, where is your forest? If your forest was like 10 years old, you wouldn't really want to be thinning. So like, where are you in that process of stand development is also, I think, something for people to take into account as well. But that's a great question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for the answer there. And there's another question here about deer protection strategies, and if there are some examples that you can share.
Sure. Yeah, there's a number of ways, from protecting individual trees through cages just around individual seedlings. That can be effective. There's bud caps, which can also be effective in certain contexts, to protecting large stands through fencing. Depending on the context, you could use electric fencing. That's typically if it's a kind of a reforestation context where you have you're starting with an open land. If you're planting within a forest, you would probably want something a little more sturdy. There's also ways of using, if you're thinking about protecting seedlings in the context of a harvest, there's ways of using the slash from that harvest to protect seedlings, either leaving the tops distributed throughout the forest that can prevent deer from getting in there, or building slash walls with those tops that can keep deer completely out of an area. So those are some examples. I don't know if you have any others, Laura.
I just wanted to flag Russ Cohen put a couple really great examples of places around here that have deer fencing, just in case people are interested in seeing that. Audubon's also used, Mass Audubon has used that at some of your projects as well. And for anyone who wants to read about sort of when tree cages or shelters versus fencing and sort of some examples and extension documents, there are also a number of those linked in the Healthy Forest Guide, just for people who want to go, you know, to an NRCS fact sheet or something another state has put out and get a little more details as well.
Yeah, great. And Jen Super also put in the forest carbon booklet, the link there. Absolutely. For those that haven't seen it. Discussion about forest carbon. And there was a question earlier from Kurt about the disturbances and, you know, what kinds of disturbances are you thinking of, and do you recommend, what management responses do you recommend to different disturbances?
Or do you want to take that first, or do you want me to go first?
I'm happy to take it first, but I'm going to be very vague about it. See, the good thing is Josh is actually a forester and I'm not. So this is, so Kurt, the responding to disturbance as the way it's laid out here is more like think ahead so that you're ready. Like is your goal for this carbon? Is your goal for this a certain set of species? Is it a certain ecosystem function like water filtration? And so it is not specific about, you know, drought versus windstorm versus flooding, for example. But I will say that part of the reason these practices are on the list is that all of them should have some resilience benefits. So they're all sort of getting at making sure that you have a diversity of tree species and you have a range of size classes and you've got all that vertical structure in there. So all of them should help. In theory, all of them should help any forest address climate change impacts. But I do think, Kurt, that one of the reasons for us in this list putting in that responding to disturbance idea is that if somebody thinks ahead and then all of their pick a species falls out of the canopy because of a big storm, instead of sort of just being like, oh no, what do I do? You know, hopefully they've thought through, all right, this forest, I am managing it for this purpose, which means if this thing happens, that important species isn't there anymore. So I'm going to underplant this new climate adapted species. So it's more like thinking about which of those techniques you might use in each situation than necessarily being able to anticipate, I'm more likely to have a drought here. I'm more likely to have an ice storm here. So that's kind of like a vague answer. Josh, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with anything.
Yeah, and I guess I would just following on the last thing you said, Laura, that the specific disturbances you want to think about will depend on the site. And so it's sort of a site level determination, whether you're worried more about, you're on top of a ridge and you're worried about drought and wind, or if you have a forest stand that has a lot of elms or hemlocks or, you know, species that have specific pests that are attacking them now, you may think about disturbance differently. But in general, building more diversity into the forest, both in terms of species composition and structure, will protect against a whole range of disturbances.
And Cynthia, I'm thinking maybe we should head on to the next set of the presentation. But again, we're gonna have like half an hour or so for questions at the end. So if anyone didn't get to ask theirs, just hold it or type it into the chat and we'll get to it in a little bit. So Cynthia, you can go to the next slide. So, you know, one thing that a lot of these, these climate smart forestry practices have in common is that almost all of them cost money. So either directly, right? So here's this person underplanting climate adapted species into this not very healthy looking forest. They're going to have to pay for the little tree shelters, the tubes that you see around there. They're going to have to pay for the saplings themselves. And unless they have volunteer labor, they're going to have to pay someone to plant them into the ground in a way that will lead to them being most successful. And if there aren't direct costs like deer fencing or tree shelters, there could be opportunity costs. So if I'm a landowner who owns 100 acres and I could really cut a lot of the economic value out of there, take sort of everything that I can sell, but instead I'm using some of these techniques and I'm balancing that need for income with keeping some of the carbon, some more of the carbon on the land, that's also a cost. That's an opportunity cost because I'm leaving money on the table. So often when we talk about this list, I feel like the next question people have is like, that's great, I'm all on board. I am concerned about climate change. I want to do these types of techniques, but who can help me cover the costs? And there's a lot of answers to that. So I'm going to quickly go through the list and then dive into a case study. And then Josh is also going to give a case study about using some of these sources. And I again want to point out that we really have attempted as much as we can to compile all of this information into one place. So links to a lot of these programs are also in that Healthy Forest Guide, or they're on the DCR website, like the same places that you're going to see these practices, you're going to see information that guides you to these funding sources. So one of the ones that I think is rightfully getting more attention now about these practices and funding is NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Many of you are probably familiar with NRCS. It's a federal agency that is often known for working with farmers to protect soil and water resources, but it funds a remarkable number of forestry practices as well, and not just kind of the ones that you may have seen out in the woods. NRCS has started doing presentations to walk people through which of their hundreds of practices that they will provide cost share funding for increase forest carbon stocks or carbon sequestration. One challenge with NRCS is that these are cost share programs. So even if you use them, they will only cover a portion of the cost that you have. There are also lots of great funding sources coming out of our state agencies. So DCR, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and Mass Wildlife, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, or Fish and Game, both have really good programs that help landowners who are doing certain types of management geared towards certain rare and endangered species, for example. DCR has long funded people who are just getting into forest management planning, and this is their first entree. And there's a rotating set of programs that these state agencies will help with. One thing that we hope will also be a state funding source in the next couple of years is the Forest Climate Resilience Program. And that is something, if you've been reading any of the planning that the state has been putting out around its climate change policy, you've seen this idea. And Josh is actually managing right now 2 municipal vulnerability preparedness program grants that are piloting the Forest Climate Resilience Program on town forests in a few towns in Western Massachusetts. So the idea of this program is that there would be incentive funding that would flow to landowners to help them pay for the costs of some of these climate smart forest practices. And then there's also the carbon markets. Next slide, please. Now, the carbon markets are a really big source of funding, but there are some questions that you definitely want to ask yourself if you're looking at any program that includes market funding as its source. So first, is the payment enabling you to do a different type of forest management than you would have done without it? Secondly, are you able to commit to that practice for the long term? And third, are you doing the practice exactly as described? And are you willing to have someone come check that this is the case? Next slide, please. So I'm going to end my portion of the talk with a case study, which is talking about the Family Forest Carbon Program. And this is a program that is currently operating in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia. And it is launching in Western and Central Massachusetts, all of Vermont, and Eastern New York next month. It's a joint effort between the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. And its goal is to bring carbon market funding to smaller family forest owners. So until very recently, if you wanted to enter the carbon markets, you had to own several thousand acres of land, and not a whole lot of owners in Massachusetts have that much land. So this brings it down to a smaller scale. Next slide, please. The Family Forest Carbon Program will fund 4 of the practices on the Climate Smart list that Josh just stepped through. And I've put the URL for the Healthy Forest Guide, because if you're interested, that will show you these practices. So they basically fall into this manage forests category: increasing time between harvests, establishing forest reserves, creating gaps to promote regeneration, or retaining more carbon in a thinning. Next slide, please. And the Family Forest Carbon Program meshes those into 2 ideas. Basically, when a landowner enrolls in the program, they have to choose one of 2 tracks. The Grow Older Forest track means that you're not going to harvest for 20 years. It is not the same as a forest reserve. A forest reserve is a deliberate, usually permanent decision to not harvest your land, but it could be the start of that process. So if a forest reserve is something that you're interested in, you might start off with this process and delay harvest at least for 20 years while you're really going through the process of communicating that you want your forest to be a reserve with your family, thinking about the long-term forest protection of the forest, all those other steps. Next slide, please. And Family Forest Carbon Program participants can also choose the second track, which is called Enhance Your Woodland. That is if you're interested in harvesting your forest at all within 20 years. And what this does is it basically meshes the create gaps and the thinning practice. So it makes them into an easier contract format, and essentially says you can do a harvest, but it has to be a pretty light-handed harvest. You can't harvest more than 15% of the basal area in your woods. There's no high grading, so you can't just take out the large or commercially valuable species. There are a number of safeguards to prevent that. Canopy gaps in total have to cover less than 20% of the harvested area, and they have to be smaller than 5 acres, and usually more like 1/4 to 2 acres. And even in those gaps and thinned areas, you still need to leave 4 big trees per acre. You need to leave the standing dead trees, the snags. So there's a bunch of adaptation and biodiversity safeguards sprinkled throughout these practices. Next slide, please. In order to be eligible for the program, landowners are going to need to have 30 acres or more of land. It's going to need to be in the maple beech birch, northern hardwood forest type, but we will quickly expand that into oak hickory. The land must be a forest that could be commercially harvested if the landowner wanted to. That gets at that first question that I raised, a question that everyone should ask themselves if they're using a carbon market program, which is this payment changing your behavior? Is it enabling you to do something that you would not have done otherwise without the payment? The land has to be located in the counties shown here, owned by a family or individual or a group like a hunt club, something with no restrictions on the management it does. Conservation restrictions, permanently protected land is great. That's a plus, unless of course you have a conservation restriction that says, you can't ever cut trees. That would make you incompatible with the program. Most land trusts are not going to be eligible for this. It's figured out on a case-by-case basis, but unless a land trust is currently managing their land for timber and they don't have any restrictions on what they can cut, then they probably won't be eligible for the program. Hopefully that and townland, land trust land and townland will be able to be brought into the program at a later date. They just need a little bit of a different baseline and accounting system. Next slide, please. How this works, there's no cost for the landowners to enroll. They sign up on a website that's going to be live in about a month. They choose one of the 2 options. They get a management plan if they don't already have one, or if they have a management plan, they revise it to reflect which practice they've chosen. They sign a contract for 20 years and they get paid every year for those 20 years. American Forest Foundation on the back end will sell carbon into the markets only if they can prove it is there and a result of the program. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that makes me cringe, but it has no numbers in it. So I'm trying to make it not too onerous. So the way the carbon accounting works for this program is that the U.S. Forest Service is constantly measuring forest carbon in Massachusetts and every other state through its forest inventory and analysis program plots. So those are the little conifers dotted around the landscape here. That's all averaged together. That gives us accurate data about how much carbon is in, for example, Western Mass maple beech birch forests in a given ecoregion. So we have a good sense of how much carbon is there in the surrounding landscape. When a forest enrolls in the Family Forest Carbon Program, there are plots established on it, and every measurement cycle, randomly selected plots from Family Forest Carbon Program lands are averaged to show how much carbon is in the Family Forest Carbon Program forests compared to everywhere else. If there's more carbon in the FFCP enrolled forests than in the surrounding area, then American Forest Foundation sells that carbon in the carbon markets. If it's the same or it's less than the surrounding area, then they don't have any carbon to sell. Now, the landowner has done what they were supposed to. They followed their contract, so they still get paid. All the risk sits with American Forest Foundation, which makes this program a little bit different. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So that's just one example of one of the funding sources that might work for some people that covers 4 out of these climate smart forestry practices. We're really going to need a patchwork of different funding sources to allow everyone who wants to do these practices to get the funding to do them. So I'm going to hand things over to Josh to talk about a different case study of using some different funding sources to do some of the climate smart forestry practices. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Laura. I will use, I'll describe a project that uses a number of other existing programs that are not necessarily set up for specifically climate smart forestry, although some are starting to incorporate climate smart forestry into those existing programs. But these are programs that are existing, long running, that can be used to do these practices. And I'll talk about a project that implements some of those climate smart forestry practices in this context. The project I'm going to talk about is at Mass Audubon's Elm Hill Wildlife Sanctuary. And I'll talk about both the process of planning for this project and its implementation. Next slide, please. So the Elm Hill Wildlife Sanctuary is in Brookfield and North Brookfield, and it covers more than 1,000 acres of forest and some fields. The open fields are currently managed for hay. The property is covered by an agricultural preservation restriction, an APR, that requires the production of agricultural products. That includes the hay that's produced, but can also include harvesting timber. The Elm Hill Forest Management Project was designed to achieve both wildlife habitat and climate adaptation goals. Today, I'll be focusing on the climate adaptation, but note that some aspects of the management focus primarily on wildlife habitat. Next slide, please. The planning for the project began in 2016 with the final treatments of invasive species associated with this round of management being completed last year. So this took a while. Initial funding came from NIFWF, for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Healthy Forest and Rivers Fund, as well as the DCR Forest Stewardship Program. Mass Audubon scientists put the stewardship plan through the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences Adaptation Workbook, which focuses on climate adaptation. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife prepared a report on options for habitat management using NRCS funds. In addition to the stewardship plan that covers the entire property, timber sale planning was done by a consulting forester for the project area, which we'll talk about in a minute. Implementation was funded by NIFWF, NRCS, and importantly, proceeds from the timber sale, which were kind of plowed back into stewardship of the property. Next slide, please. Forest stewardship plans are typically for 10 years, but in this case, we asked our forester to use a 100-year plan horizon and zone the property into different management units where treatments would occur in different years over that, different time periods over that 100-year period. The map shown here is the portion of the property that saw management in the first 10-year time block, so the current time block. As I mentioned before, the DCR Forest Stewardship Program provided cost share. The plan format followed the Foresters for the Birds format and was focused on improving habitat for specific bird species. The clearing to create young forest and connect existing fields was done specifically for creating high quality habitat for grassland birds and those that rely on young forests. The more northerly areas were selectively cut to increase structural complexity of the forest and promote regeneration of an additional age class of the forest. This enhances both the habitat for wildlife and has adaptation benefits. Since completing, or actually beginning while this project was still underway, Mass Audubon has been working with DCR, NIACS, that's the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and the New England Forestry Foundation to create a new stewardship plan type that is focused on climate adaptation and carbon. The Forest Stewardship Climate Plan was launched in February with the initial training series attended by 15 consulting foresters. And landowners can now receive cost share for getting a climate plan. Next slide, please. Mass Audubon implemented several climate smart practices in this project. Through the planning process, we delineated reserves, areas that would not be harvested over the 100-year time frame of the plan. We also staggered planned harvest over that entire 100-year planning horizon that effectively delays harvest on most of the property, with doing harvest now on just a small part of it. We removed invasive species, especially along forest edges and in areas where the young forest was created. The picture on the bottom of this slide shows the edge of a hayfield and what is now a meadow of native species, but will over time become young forest. Much of the harvested area was designed to increase forest resilience to climate change. The picture on the right shows an area of structural complexity enhancement where individual trees were felled and left in place to create small gaps where new seedlings can establish and add a new age class to what is otherwise a fairly uniform forest. Finally, care was taken to conduct harvest in a way that minimized ground disturbance to protect soil carbon. This included only harvesting when there were frozen ground conditions, which proved to be tricky. The harvesting actually had to take place over 2 successive winters because the harvest was shut down in the first winter because the ground thawed out, and the loggers had to take their equipment off site. That costs money, and so that's a cost to implementing kind of a higher standard of operations. Next slide. And this is the last slide. I just wanted to end back on this slide. The partners in this project have worked hard to come to a consensus of what constitutes climate smart forestry in terms of the practices on the ground. There is now funding to implement these practices from both existing and new programs. And we hope today's presentation has shed some light on what climate smart forestry is and how to do it. I'll be putting some links in the chat for some of these resources, and we can take more questions.
All right, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Laura, for that presentation component. And let's go on. I think there was one new, oh yeah, Josh is putting on the link for the Nature Conservancy's Climate Smart Forestry link website and Mass Audubon's as well.
One more.
And yeah, people have questions, please put them into the chat.
Cynthia, would you like me to answer the new question that's there?
Yeah, I didn't see it where it went. Yes, please do.
Sure. So I actually think this is a great question, Russ, and it's very, like, what you've asked is very common. So for people who didn't see that in the chat, the question was, it is, is my understanding that a lot of state current use taxation programs, what we call chapter programs in Massachusetts, at least the forestry ones, require some tree cutting in order to be enrolled in the program. I know Maine's does this. Is there any effort underway by anyone to amend these laws or policies to enable a no-cut option for folks that want to allow the larger trees to grow? I understand that bigger trees sequester more carbon than the smaller trees. So I'm really glad that you asked this question, Russ, because you're correct in terms of like some other states' programs. In Massachusetts, Chapter 61 does not require you to cut every 10 years. And that's a big misconception that people have. So some people get worried, they cut 2 years ago, they want to enroll and they wonder if they'll be pressured to cut maybe before their management plan says that they should. Chapter 61 forestry requires you to follow your management plan. And some management plans say that the time for a cut is not within a 10-year period. However, we know that's a really common misconception. I appreciate the work that DCR, which administers the program, has done to sort of address that on a case-by-case basis with people, but it's still something that gives people pause. And so I know that a lot of the work that DCR is doing around carbon, because they think about carbon long and hard, as does Mass Wildlife, is also thinking about how to make sure that people recognize that, not every forest needs to be cut every 10 years, and that following your management plan doesn't necessarily mean you have to do, a commercial timber harvest every couple years. There is a bill right now, Senate 1880, that does not revise Chapter 61, but it does create a program that would sit on top of Chapter 61 that would make people who choose these climate smart types of forestry practices eligible for an additional incentive to help them cover their costs and recognize that they're choosing options that sort of help us all through increased forest resilience and carbon storage. And also, I will say, I'll just end before I see if Josh wants to add anything. So the Nature Conservancy has had properties enrolled in Chapter 61 in the past, and some of them we didn't cut within 10 years. It's definitely a property by property basis, as long as someone's not ignoring their management plan. They can't be at the point where, yes, your management plan says cut, you've worked that out with your forester, and then you just sort of don't do it. Like you do need to follow the plan that's laid out for your land, because part of the beauty of the Chapter 61 program is that it keeps this continuous supply of sustainable and local wood products, along with all the other benefits that it has. So Josh, sorry, that was a lot of talking, but I don't know if you want to add other things to that question.
Yeah, I think that covers it. I mean, the law says that you have to be managing for timber products, but that doesn't stipulate a particular timing for harvesting. And it doesn't mean you have to harvest your entire property.
Are there other questions that people would like to put into the chat? So here's one. Do either of you know about the status of NRCS's Healthy Forest Reserve program? I thought it used to be a standalone program, but then had heard it's no longer an option under the NRCS easement program. So is climate smart forestry an option under that program, the Healthy Forest Reserve program?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the status of that. I know that that's come up where it seems like it's not as available right now, but sometimes these NRCS offerings for individual states kind of come and go.
It's an excellent question that I also don't know the answer to, but I was just glancing at another part of my screen to see if I can find. NRCS just did a presentation on like the ways that their practices and programs can increase carbon storage, and they were just listing out, it was almost like a walkthrough. So I'm going to see if I can dig that up and put it in the chat. I don't know whether that will answer the question, but it'll at least give you a sense of what NRCS is saying these days about, how do you meet these different goals within the existing NRCS programs.
Great, thank you for that. And here's another question, wondering about why a conservation easement or conservation restriction with a no cut provision not be allowed in the family forest program.
Also a great question. So it basically comes down to that first question that I laid out, which is, does this payment allow you to do something that you wouldn't do otherwise? So if someone has a protected forest, which is great, the very first practice on our climate smart forestry list is keep forest as forest, because that is a critical action to take, whether you care about carbon, biodiversity, water, like anything. But in the case of someone who is not allowed to cut already, there's no additionality. The program isn't changing their behavior. The money isn't allowing them to do anything differently. And so ethically, that is not something that the Family Forest Carbon Program will let into the program, because they're just not meeting their standards of showing that the change in behavior was due to enrollment in the Family Forest Carbon Program and the money there. Essentially, any credits that came off of that land aren't things that they would feel comfortable selling. So for now, they're not in the program. That said, as you know, as Josh and I've mentioned, there's all sorts of sources for paying for these types of practices. So just because one program doesn't happen to work for your particular situation doesn't mean that you can't turn around and look at NRCS or the eventual, state forest climate resilience program, hopefully when that expands from its pilot phase to work for private landowners. So definitely there are other options to look at for that scenario.
Great, thank you. And there's another question here about that 5-acre patch cuts seem really enormous, and it seems like the results of such large patches will be large losses of carbon from the soil and wood and things. Are there methods to manage forests that have very small patch cuts that can mimic natural forest turnover? Of course, that's not the tornado strike that takes out a whole swath, but other kinds of windstorms and things, maybe as examples.
I am a little bit sad that the Family Forest Carbon Program contract says you can do 5-acre gaps. The way it's laid out in the Healthy Forest for Our Future guide, that's not, the intent is not that people should go around doing 5-acre gaps and calling it a carbon practice. So I just want to clarify that 5-acre gap would be in the context of only being able to create gaps on up to 20% of the land, 80% of which is left completely uncut. And it probably isn't the ideal for a lot of landowners unless there's a certain wildlife species. Like that's the challenge with gap size, is that if someone has a mix of values that they're going for, they really care about carbon, they want to balance that out, they want to see that increase, but they also are concerned about bird species that are in decline that need those larger gaps, then 5 acres is still awfully small for a wildlife opening, but that it might be a way to balance that. And Josh, I don't know if you want to, I just want to plug your Foresters for the Birds, because it's like the most beautiful set of outreach materials I think I've ever seen. Like the Little Foresters for the Birds guide that Mass Audubon puts out is worth, I think you put the link in there, people can get to it from your page, but it's worth checking out because A, it's really well done, and B, it walks people through like which species are you interested in and why do you need different types of habitat across the landscape for these. So it might give you a more detail about that gap size question. And Josh, I don't know if you want to jump in on that at all.
Yeah, I'd just say that there's from a forest dynamics perspective, there's a range of natural disturbances that result in a range of gap sizes. So those kind of individual tree events, like what we were mimicking at Elm Hill and that structural complexity enhancement area, to what Cynthia just mentioned as a tornado coming through, or the 1938 hurricane that leveled, huge areas. And different forest types and particular tree species, as well as the wildlife, really depend on different gap sizes to regenerate. It's hard to regenerate oak unless you have larger gaps, for instance. And so I think my my reading of the Family Forest Carbon Program, and that limit is that it gives landowners flexibility to manage for different goals while also maintaining carbon on the landscape. And so, yeah, there are ways of managing forests to mimic, the single tree disturbance, but you're going to get a specific suite of species, both in terms of the trees and the wildlife when you do that, and not the entire suite.
Yeah, and that's a great answer, Josh. I mean, I think it's reflecting that these practices that have both carbon and adaptation and biodiversity benefits, like you might do them slightly differently depending on what your ultimate goal is. None of them are going to be things that are quote unquote bad for the forest. They're all good forestry and good practices. But that was a really great answer, Josh, because you need to know what it is that you're trying to do as you think about how to implement these. And I will also say, for these practices that have carbon benefits, some of them are just not appropriate for some forests. If you're in a forest that needs restoration, these are not going to be the right type of management. You're going to need some of the ones that are on that combined list, that get more into transitioning and sort of changing the makeup of the forest considerably. So I think I'm usually more careful to point out that this is not a list of everything good you should ever do in the forest. This is a specific list that was looking at climate smart, that combination of carbon and adaptation.
Great, thank you for that. There's another question here. What are the trade-offs involved in cutting forests in order to do large ground-mounted solar installations? So is the carbon saved from using solar electricity from panels more or less than what a forest would sequester, store? And what are the factors that would inform a decision about whether or not a landowner should do this?
I'm happy to jump in on that one, Josh, or let you do it. Our two organizations get asked this question all the time.
Yeah. You can jump in on that.
Okay. I mean, this is such a good question, and it's such an important one, because I think underlying that question is the recognition that we desperately need more renewable energy, and at the same time that concern about have we gotten to the point where we need those trade-offs, where we need to be putting solar into intact forests as opposed to on roofs or parking lots or degraded sites. So my understanding of it is that if you were simply looking at carbon on a year-to-year basis, solar is going to win out every time. However, this is one of the reasons why it's not a great idea to look at forests only for their carbon. And a colleague of mine, Mark Anderson, likes to say that doing that, like caring about forests only because of carbon, is like caring about people just because they have a lot of calcium in them. Like it just fundamentally doesn't make sense. And so when I think about the value of forests, I don't just think about their carbon storage or their carbon sequestration. It's the wildlife that they house. It's the water, drinking water that they provide. It's all the wood products and maple syrup and everything that we get from them. It's, the health benefits. It's that full suite. And that is where I think it gets a little bit trickier for people to figure out how to balance needing to have a huge increase in renewable energy, and when they are at the point that it makes sense to make that trade-off, to put them into an intact forest versus not. So, Josh, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's it. Like it's that trade-off is challenging. I agree with Laura 100% that carbon is not the only value the only thing we should value from forests, and that as much as we can, we should be putting solar in other places before we get to that point.
Yeah, great, thanks. And here's another question about the evaluation of individual tree species in terms of their relative utility for storing and sequestering carbon, so that if somebody wants to do planting, which one would you plant, basically? How would you find that out? Where do you get that information?
I actually don't have a resource at my fingertips for that specific question, but I think I'm going to like to take maybe just following up what we just talked about with solar, is that I wouldn't focus on planting trees and forests just for their carbon benefit. If you did that, you would pick the fastest growing species for your region, which would probably be white pine, but that would leave you'd have a monoculture, and that would leave that forest susceptible to disturbance. 80 years ago, people were planting a whole lot of red pine that there's red pine plantations across the state that are all dying altogether right now, because they got to the end of their lifetime. They're susceptible to pests and diseases, and they degrade really fast. So we're losing all that carbon very quickly. So I don't think it's a better approach to, if you're thinking about planting a diversity of species for which is just going to be more resilient over time.
I would totally agree with that. And Josh, only because someone asked me this very question on a webinar 2 weeks ago, I do have a resource to suggest, which was already brought up. I think Jennifer Howard mentioned it. I don't remember who in the chat put it. The UMass forest carbon booklet actually has like the different forest types and the average carbon stocks within them. So it'll give you a partial answer to that. However, I totally agree with everything Josh said. Like, as an academic question, that might help answer a little bit some of that for you. But and there are some general lists out there, but I agree with everything that Josh was saying, that that taking that separately is challenging for all the reasons Josh mentioned, and because a forest doesn't act the way one individual species would in a monoculture. So that was a great answer, Josh.
And also I would just add that whatever trees are planted or get their growth and longevity are going to depend on what soils they're growing in. So your site conditions are pretty important there as well.
And I have been corrected in the chat. Jen Soper posted that. So thank you, Jen. Sorry about that. Thanks for putting that in there.
And there's another question just about trainings. So thinking about the volunteer committees that are out there, the conservation commissions, the agricultural commissions, how do we get, how are we helping those volunteers learn more about, climate smart forestry and forest management? Where would you recommend people be going for more information?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Well, one would be the links we just put in the chat. But I do know that DCR, as part of their climate forestry program, is thinking about that audience, particularly conservation commissions and their role in reviewing harvest plans, particularly. So that's I know DCR is thinking about that, and I would certainly think more about that. I think that's a great question. And there are, like with Foresters for the Birds that Laura mentioned, the outreach materials there. Mass Audubon is working with DCR to create a series on climate smart forestry as well. So those are coming.
Yeah, you're getting like the hot off the presses sort of presentations about these, but they're great outreach workshops and efforts planned through the grants that Josh is administering, and also through our partnership on both of these projects. We're partnered with Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and they also are always thinking about how to get this information into the hands of people, increasingly with COVID, and also just for more access. They've been thinking about how to record those things so that it's not even a matter of finding out about them and being there in real time, but being able to access those materials online and in a self-paced way. So that there will be trainings for foresters, trainings for town officials, trainings for landowners coming.
Great, thank you for that. And Russ included another response about the solar development in here that I guess EEA Kirkgardner did an analysis that showed that we have plenty of space put up solar panels without needing to cut down our forests for that. So that's just a comment there.
And Kurt has presented on this. I think it was recorded, Kurt. I went to some conference that you, I don't, like if you happen to have the link or can write down the conference, because I know. But anyway, Kurt did a really good presentation on this. If people want to dig it up, that got into many more of those details that are too much to get into here about what the state is doing to make sure that they are balancing, like ramping up that renewable energy, but having the incentives set so that it becomes more and more possible for people to put that in places where you have the least trade-offs.
Right, and there was another follow-up from Joel about the forest quality and how what impact that has on it. But let's go back to the question that Markel had there in terms of moving the knowledge about the climate smart forest practices and how can we incorporate those into the conservation restriction template. I mean, this is so new that probably hasn't happened yet, but what would your recommendation or response be to that?
Yeah, that idea has been coming up, and I think that's something we need to work on.
Yeah,
Markel, I'd love to work on it with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I am thinking back to a lot of conservation restriction terms where it says like all forestry must follow the best management practices as laid out by DCR in 2011 or such successor documents as they become available. Like I think that some approach like that would be helpful, and we're really lucky in that we did have this partnership on all of these practices with NIACS, with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So they're listed on the Forest Service website, for example, like some of these references are already there and more are probably coming. So that would be kind of one possible way to refer to like a publication and any successor and not have to worry that you're going to write something in that's going to become problematic or obsolete. Like go here, the Forest Service is not going anywhere, go look at this page. And also because they're always doing that science, they're going to be able to update those over time as they find out that we need to do different things, or these aren't working in certain places. So that might be, if I were writing one tomorrow, I might use that kind of language as my reference. But I agree with what you said, Josh. That's a fantastic project, Markel, for you and Josh and others to tackle.
Great. Thank you, Laura and Josh. I think we got to all the questions that are in there. I'm just going to put down the link to the SurveyMonkey in terms of providing some response about this workshop for feedback for future sessions. Do you, either Laura or Josh, do you guys have any last minute comments or suggestions or other things that you'd like to share before we end the session? We've got 2 minutes left.
One thing that I would say that I just forgot to say earlier is that there's a field trip tomorrow to Elm Hill. If anybody, I think some of you are signed up to that, and you'll get to see some of what I talked about in action. There's also another one that's going to Northampton, to Arcadia, and also to a golf course restoration that will also use some of these practices.
Yeah, they're great field trips. There's Mass Audubon leads a great field trip. There's also one to the Stebbins Wildlife Refuge. I was looking at all these and being jealous that I'm tied up in other things and can't go to them, but hopefully many of you are signed up for those field trips. And yeah, Cynthia, I think I just want to end by thanking everyone again. I know that these time slots are hard. This was a long time slot in a kind of weird time, and really appreciate people taking the time not only to listen, but to ask such great questions of me and Josh. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good. And thank you, Josh and Laura, very much. We appreciate it. I will stop the recording and we'll close out the session. So have a good afternoon, everybody, and hope you can enjoy all the other sessions that are still to come.
Bye.